Chapter 8. The Funeral. It was late afternoon. John Bentley lay on the bed in the semi-darkness. Alone in the back bedroom of the house in Brentwood, and unable to leave it, he had plenty of time to think about what had happened. He and Linda were in big trouble, it seemed to him. He had no identity now, and he was a prisoner in his own home. He tried to imagine his future, but he couldn't find anything to believe in. He had slept most of the earlier part of the day, but his sleep had been troubled by bad dreams, and he had been woken from time to time by the ringing of the telephone. But now he was wide awake, waiting for Linda to return. She had gone to identify the body of her husband, and then to make arrangements for his funeral. At last, John could lie still no longer. He went carefully downstairs to the kitchen and made himself a drink. He was still there at 5:30 when Linda came home. She was carrying Colin Fenton's suitcase. She was furious when she saw John in the kitchen. "What are you doing down here?" she whispered angrily. "Get upstairs at once." "I've not made any noise, Linda," John said quietly. "And I've not turned the light on." He pointed at the kitchen curtains, which were closed. "No one can see in." She let him stay. "Okay. Sit on the floor," Linda said. "We can't take any risks." John did as he was told. He didn't want to go back upstairs yet. Linda checked the curtains carefully and switched on the electric light. Then she opened Colin Fenton's suitcase. Inside the case, in a large plastic bag, were the clothes which Colin had been wearing when he died. He would be dressed in his business suit for his funeral. There were also some clean shirts and underclothes, and a briefcase in the suitcase. In a smaller plastic bag there were a few personal items: Colin's watch, his wedding ring, and his mobile phone. The phone was broken. It had been in Colin's jacket pocket, and it had been crushed by the steering wheel in the accident. The watch was broken, too. Linda threw the phone and the watch in the waste bin. She examined the ring carefully. "It isn't worth much," she said, "but it is gold. I'll sell it later." She put it inside her handbag. Then she opened the dead man's briefcase. She glanced quickly at the papers and files inside it, then she threw those in the bin. There were several zipped pockets inside the briefcase. Linda checked them all, but she didn't find what she was looking for. She frowned. "The police would have told me," she began. Then she stopped and checked the suitcase again. There was a zipped pocket inside that, too. Linda opened it quickly. The envelope was still there. She pulled it out, opened it, and counted the money nervously. £5,000. It was all there. She sighed. The money had been borrowed. It was part of an advance paid by Frankie Simpson for the jewellery he was going to fence for them. "How are you feeling, John?" Linda asked her husband. She was calmer now. "I need to get out of this house soon," he replied, "and the phone's been ringing all day." "I can believe that," Linda said. Earlier that day, before going to identify the body, Linda had told the manager at the jewellery shop about John's death. She had also told Frankie Simpson about it, and Frankie would have told John's old friends at the Red Lion. People had obviously been phoning to talk to Linda about John's accident, and to sympathize with her. Well, she and John had to continue with the lie now. And anyway, only by doing that could they carry out the robbery and escape safely with the money. "I'm hungry, Linda," John said. "I need something to eat." "You'd better get back upstairs," she told him. "I'll cook you something and bring it up to you in half an hour." John returned quietly to the back bedroom. He lay on the bed again, still angry with Linda for getting him into this situation. Soon he heard her coming upstairs. She entered the room carrying a tray with a plate of hamburgers on it. John sat up and began to eat hungrily. "I'm going out again now," Linda said. "I'll probably be back late." "Where are you going?" John did not want to be alone again. "I'm going to get rid of Fenton's car." Colin's BMW was in the Bentley's garage. Linda looked up and down the street before she went to get it. But it was dark outside now. The neighbours would not notice Linda driving away in a car which did not belong to her. Linda drove to the M25 and travelled along it until she was on the western side of London. She turned off the motorway when she came to the exit for Heathrow Airport. She drove Colin's car into one of the long-stay car parks and parked it there. The long-stay car park was a good place to leave Colin's car, Linda thought. It would be some time before anybody realized that the BMW had been abandoned. And when the police did know about it, they would think that Colin had got on a plane and left the country. They wouldn't search for him. They certainly wouldn't suspect that he was dead. Linda knew that hundreds of people went missing every year in Britain. Colin Fenton would simply become another missing person. Linda walked from the car park to Heathrow Central Underground station. Soon she was sitting on a train going back across the city. It was nearly midnight when she arrived at Upminster Station. From there she took a taxi home. John was asleep. The tray and the dirty plate were on the floor beside his bed. The next few days were difficult for Linda. She couldn't stop visitors coming to the house. John had to stay inside his room most of the time and be very quiet. He felt like a trapped animal. Often he wanted to run outside and scream, but he knew he had to stay hidden. He kept his gun in a drawer beside the bed, and sometimes he took the gun out and held it in his hand. He'd never fired the gun at anyone, but as he lay there in the dark room, he wondered what it would be like to kill someone with it. After the first couple of days, he slept with a gun under his pillow. The gun made him feel safe. Then it was the day of the funeral. The body was going to be cremated. Linda told everyone that that was what her husband had wanted. The funeral took place at a crematorium near Brentwood. A few of John and Linda's colleagues from Sandwells came to the crematorium, and so did Frankie Simpson, and some of John's other mates from the Red Lion. By the afternoon, all that was left of Colin Fenton was a container of ashes. Linda had asked for the ashes to be scattered in the garden of the crematorium. When Linda arrived home after the cremation, she went upstairs to see how John was. She opened the door of the back bedroom. It was dark in the room, but Linda could just see her husband. He was pointing his gun at her. "I've had enough of this, Linda," he said angrily. "I can't stay here any more. You've made me a prisoner." "You're not a prisoner, John," she said calmly, as though talking to a child. She moved closer to him. "We're in this together, John. We both have to be strong." "It's madness," John said, sitting up. He was staring at Linda, furious with her. "This whole plan is madness. It'll never work." Linda touched him gently on the arm. He pushed her hand away, violently. "Why have you done this to me?" he said. "You've taken my life away from me. I'm trapped." "John," she said softly, "we've got to be patient. We need to wait just a couple of weeks, that's all. Then we'll do the robbery and we'll get away. No one will ever find us, and we'll have all the money we could want. 2 more weeks and we'll be free, John. We'll be free forever." John allowed Linda to touch his arm now. "I don't believe it," he said quietly. "You have to believe it, John," Linda said. "It's true." She sat on the bed beside him, and she took the gun from his hand. "Listen, John, in a few days' time I'll go back to work, but I'm going to tell Mr. Rose that I'll be leaving my job at Sandwell's at the end of the month. That's in just a couple of weeks. I'll tell him I can't live here alone without my husband. I'll tell him I'm going back to Scotland. I've already cancelled the lease on this house. Just before I leave the shop, you'll do the robbery as we planned. Now that you're officially dead, your alibi is even better than before, isn't it? John Bentley can't rob shops. He's a dead man. It's the best possible alibi, and I'll only have to behave normally at work for a few days after the robbery." Suddenly, Linda smiled. "I'm sorry, John, my love," she said. "I know this is very difficult for you. Look, it's dark now. Let's go out for a couple of hours. We'll go for a drink and a meal. We'll go somewhere where nobody knows us. Let's go north towards Saffron Walden. We'll find a village pub in that area. Nobody will recognize you there." John realized that he had no choice but to agree to his wife's plan for the robbery. And after that, they would both have to leave the country as soon as possible. Meanwhile, he was happy with the idea of leaving the house for a few hours. 10 minutes later, Linda was driving the van northwards towards Cambridge. John was hiding in the back. In a small village just south of Saffron Walden, they stopped for a drink and a meal in an old pub. They weren't worried that anybody would know them there. It wasn't the kind of place their friends visited. As they sat in the warm restaurant, looking at the bright log fire, Linda put her hand on her husband's arm. "Just a few weeks more, John," she said again. "Then we'll be free." Chapter 9. The Advertisement. On the day her husband was cremated near Brentwood as John Bentley, Julie went to work early. She was in her office at CJF Software Solutions before anyone else arrived. At 9 o'clock, she moved from her own desk to Colin's. There was work to do, Colin's as well as her own, and she had a pile of letters and papers in front of her. She was trying to read them calmly, and she was trying not to cry. But she couldn't stop the tears running down her cheeks. There had been no news of Colin, and she was desperately worried. Julie wasn't used to working on the company's finances, but the accounts had to be brought up to date, so she was trying to learn about them quickly. She read through the letters, and she quickly filed the invoices, getting them ready to take to Mr. Booker, the company's accountant. Among the papers on the desk was a fax from Jackman's, the insurance brokers. It didn't contain good news. Jackman's didn't want to continue with the tests for the new software product. They decided that they were going to continue to use the software they already had. Julie was angry about this news. She'd wasted 2 months' development work on that project. She pushed her fingers through her thick red hair. Then she stood up and began walking round the room. She was tense. She needed time to relax and to think about the future of the business. When Rob and Jenny, Julie's 2 assistant programmers, arrived at 9:30, she gave them a list of jobs to do during the day. Then she put the files of invoices into her briefcase and went to see Mr. Booker. Booker's office was dark and uncomfortably warm. Booker was sitting at his desk, his head down, his shoulders bent. When Julie entered the room, he spoke without looking up. "I'm not surprised he's run away." "How did you know?" Julie said, sitting down in front of the desk. She had only met Booker once or twice before, but she didn't like him very much. Booker coughed into his handkerchief. "News like that travels fast," he said slowly. "It doesn't surprise me at all." "Why? What do you mean?" "When I last saw your husband, we talked about your company's serious financial problems," Booker replied. Julie looked puzzled. "He must have told you about our conversation," Booker said. "No," Julie said. "He told me nothing." Booker raised his eyebrows. "Well, the simple truth is, you're spending more money than you're earning. Your company is seriously in debt." Julie looked straight at Booker, unable to believe what she was hearing. How could Colin have kept this news from her? "How much do we owe?" she asked. "About £10,000 at this moment," Booker replied. "Your husband said he'd arranged a bank loan. He was waiting for a valuable contract to be confirmed, and he needed the loan till you'd been paid for the new software." Booker paused a moment. Then he said, "That contract has been confirmed, hasn't it?" Julie was shocked, but she was beginning to understand. "No," she said. "It hasn't been confirmed. In fact, we've lost the contract." "I see," Booker said. He smiled nastily. He seemed pleased. "That explains everything, then." "What do you mean?" "Your husband can't accept failure, so he's run away." Julie didn't like what Booker was saying, or the unpleasant way he was saying it. She wondered why she and Colin had ever given him their accounts to work on. But she had no time to look for a new accountant now. She had enough problems already. She tried to be polite. "My husband wouldn't run away. He's not that kind of person, Mr. Booker," she said. "And anyway, he couldn't have known about the contract when he disappeared. I only had the news this morning." Julie put the folder of invoices on Booker's desk and got up to leave. "You've got a big debt to pay back," Booker said, lifting his head slightly. "I'd do something about that very soon, if I were you." That evening, Julie sat down at her kitchen table to do some more work on the company's finances. When she was too tired to continue, she made herself a hot drink, then went into the living room. Some CD boxes lay in an untidy pile on the floor in front of the stereo. She picked one at random and put it into the machine. A blues song started to play. Suddenly, tears were running down Julie's face again. "Oh, Colin, where are you?" she said aloud. A photo of Colin stood on the low table beside the sofa. Julie picked it up. Colin, relaxed and smiling in the bright sunlight, was sitting outside a cafe by the sea. Julie had taken the photo herself 2 years before, while they were on holiday in the south of France. She shook her head as the tears ran down her cheeks. "Where are you?" she repeated in a soft voice. She could no longer keep the bad thoughts out of her mind. Perhaps the police were right. Perhaps Colin had abandoned her because he didn't love her any more. Or perhaps Booker was right, and Colin had run away from his business problems because he couldn't accept failure. Julie didn't know who was right, and she didn't care. All she wanted was to have her husband back home again. Somebody somewhere must know where Colin is, she thought. Somebody must have seen him. She decided to put an advertisement in the national newspapers. She would put Colin's photo in the ad. Someone might remember seeing him. Someone might help her find him again. Chapter 10. The Search. Mark Ashwood switched off his computer. He put some papers into a folder, and he put the folder on a shelf. The research on export regulations, which he'd done for his new client, had been interesting. Now he'd finished preparing a report on what he'd learnt. He went downstairs and got himself a cold drink from his fridge. It was a Friday evening, and Mark had finished work for the week. On the Monday morning after the car accident, he had telephoned the policewoman at Thame, and he'd learnt the identity and the address of the man who had died. But for the next couple of weeks, Mark had been too busy to think about a visit to the man's wife, or about what he might say to her. Mark finished his drink and sighed happily. He had arranged to go out with some friends that evening, and the next day they were all going climbing in Wales. In Mark's opinion, rock climbing was the perfect way to relax. It was a sport that required calmness and self-control, and it was exciting to climb a steep rock face with nothing below you but the sea. He was going to enjoy his weekend. But on Monday, he'd take the report to his new client in East London, and then, he decided, he'd better visit Mrs. Bentley. She was the widow of the man who had died in the car crash. He had to tell her what her husband had said just before his death. Mark set off from Stratford-upon-Avon early on the Monday morning. He reached his new client's offices on the south-east side of London just before 10:30. Mark and his client spent the rest of the morning and the whole of the afternoon discussing exports and other business. When their discussions were completed, Mark and his client made arrangements for another meeting in about 10 days' time. A few minutes later, Mark was sitting in his blue Volvo in the company's car park, studying a map of the Brentwood area. Having found John Bentley's street on the map, he started his car and drove towards Brentwood. He decided not to phone the man's widow first. It would be difficult to tell her that he wanted to visit her without telling her why, and he didn't want to tell her that till he saw her. It was dark now, and it was raining. People were leaving their workplaces and going home, so the roads were very busy. It was an hour before Mark reached the address he was looking for. Mark parked his car outside the Bentley's house. The street was long and straight, and it was lined on both sides with small, square houses with garages beside them. The street was not well lit. Mark switched off his car engine and looked up at the house. There were no lights burning inside. It looked as though Mrs. Bentley wasn't at home. Mark's journey had probably been a waste of time. He hurried to the front door and rang the bell. To his surprise, he heard sounds of movement inside the house, and for a moment he saw a light through the glass in the front door, a light in a back room of the house. Someone was at home after all. He rang the bell again. Then the light in the back room went off. Now the house seemed silent and empty. Mark went back to his car and wondered what to do. He was going to visit his client in London again in about 10 days' time. He could try to contact Mrs. Bentley again then. But he really wanted to see her at once. He prepared carefully what he wanted to say, and he wanted to say it today. He glanced at his watch. It was 7:15. Mark decided to go and eat some dinner somewhere and then to come back. If Julie wasn't home when he returned, he'd have to try again the next time he was in London. He started the engine and drove away to find a pub or a restaurant. That afternoon, Linda Bentley had told the manager at Sandwell's that she wanted to leave her job at the end of the month. Mr. Rose liked Linda, and he was sorry to hear her news, but he hadn't argued with her. He hadn't tried to change her mind. As soon as the shop closed, Linda went to see Frankie Simpson at the Red Lion. She telephoned first and Frankie was expecting her when she arrived at 6:30 that evening. They sat together at a table in the corner of the pub. "Shall we get down to business?" Frankie said. "You told me that the deal we arranged will still go ahead." "Yes," Linda replied. "John's death makes no difference to the deal." "And you want me to fence a big pile of jewellery. Is that right?" "Yes, more than £1 million worth." Frankie raised his eyebrows. "That's a hell of a lot of jewellery, Linda," he said. "Can you sell the jewellery for me?" "Yes, I can fence it," Frankie said. "But who's going to do the robbery? I thought John was going to do it, but now—" "You don't need to know that," Linda replied. "When will I get the cash?" "It isn't easy to raise that much cash," Frankie said. "I can't fence that much jewellery in the London area. Some of it'll have to go north, to Birmingham and to Manchester. I've got good contacts in the jewellery trade in both cities, but it'll take a little time to move the stuff." "So how long will it take?" "It would help if I knew exactly what kind of stuff you're going to bring me," Frankie said. "I can give you a detailed list," Linda said. "I'll let you have it in a few days." "When's the robbery going to happen?" "In about 10 days' time." Frankie thought for a moment. Then he said, "As soon as I get that list, I can inform my contacts. That way I'll make sure they'll have the cash ready when we deliver the jewellery. Of course, these people won't pay more than 50% of the jewellery's value. You know that, don't you?" "Yes, I know that, Frankie." "OK. Well, give me 3 days after you hand over the stuff to me. Then you'll be able to collect the cash." "Fine," Linda said. "And while we're talking about money, we'd better discuss my share, Linda," Frankie said. "Fencing stolen jewellery is a dangerous business. I'll be taking a big risk. What are you offering me?" £75,000, Linda said. Frankie laughed. "That's not enough, my dear," he said. "There's a big risk, and I'll need a lot of help. I'll have to pay my men." "How much do you want, then?" 120,000. It was Linda's turn to laugh. "You must be joking," she said. "We've got to move the stuff fast," said Frankie, "and that costs money." "OK, I'll give you 100,000. No more," said Linda. "OK, Linda," Frankie agreed. "It's a deal." It was 9 o'clock that evening when Linda turned onto the drive in front of her garage. The headlights of her van lit up the figure of a man standing at her front door. Linda got out of the van and went up to him. "Who are you?" she said. "What do you want?" "Mrs. Bentley?" Mark asked. "Yes." "I'm very sorry to call so late, but I was in the area and I need to speak to you. My name's Ashwood, Mark Ashwood." Linda looked puzzled. They stood there in the dark, staring at each other. "You don't know me," Mark went on. "I've got to talk to you about your husband, Mrs. Bentley. I was there when he died. He asked me to give you a message." Linda unlocked the front door. "Come in," she said. As they stepped into the house, a voice called out, "Linda, is that you?" Linda stopped suddenly. For a moment, Mark saw a figure at the top of the stairs, but almost at once the man turned and disappeared into one of the upstairs rooms. Suddenly, Mark's body was trembling with shock, as though he'd seen a ghost. The man's face had been exactly like the face of John Bentley, the man he'd seen die near Thame. Linda had to think quickly, but that was something she'd always been good at. She smiled sadly at Mark. "A dear friend of mine is keeping me company," she said, "and my friend wasn't expecting me to arrive home with anybody else, and my husband died so recently." She shrugged her shoulders. "Well, doesn't look good to have a man in the house, does it?" Mark didn't know what to say. He felt foolish, and he wished he hadn't come. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bentley," he said nervously. "Come into the living room," Linda said. "I'll make us some tea." Mark sat down in the Bentleys' living room and listened to the sounds of the woman making tea in the kitchen. He was confused. What was happening here? The man in the wrecked car had given him a message for his wife, Julie, but the man at the top of the stairs had called out Linda, not Julie. Soon the woman came into the room carrying tea things on a tray. She poured tea into 2 cups and handed one to Mark. "You must think I'm a terrible person," she said. "But the truth is, my husband and I weren't very happy together. Perhaps you understand. Are you married yourself?" "No, I'm not," Mark said, sipping his tea. It was time to say what he had come here to say. "Your husband was driving in front of me that night, Mrs. Bentley," he went on. "The road was covered in ice. I saw his car spin on the ice and crash into a tree. I stopped to help him. Before he died, he asked me to speak to you. I'm sure he said, 'Tell Julie I'm sorry.' Those were his last words. But if your name is Linda, not Julie, perhaps I misunderstood him." "Perhaps my husband was confused," Linda said. "Yes, perhaps he was," said Mark. "I'm glad you came, Mr. Ashwood," Linda said. "It was very good of you to visit me." She smiled. "I appreciate what you did for my husband when he was dying." Mark finished his tea and stood up. "I'd better go now," he said. The woman took him to the front door and watched him hurry down the dark path towards his car. It was almost 1 o'clock when Mark arrived home in Stratford. He had a shower, then he went to bed. But he couldn't sleep. He couldn't relax. His meeting with Mrs. Bentley had worried him badly. Had the Bentleys' marriage really been so bad? It must have been, he thought. Only a few weeks after her husband's death, Mrs. Bentley hadn't seemed unhappy, and she'd had another man in her house, a man who looked exactly like her dead husband. It was all very strange. And as John Bentley was dying, he had spoken about his wife, calling her Julie. But Mrs. Bentley seemed to be called Linda, not Julie. That was strange, too. There was a puzzle here, and Mark wanted to solve it. He thought about these things for hours, until he finally fell asleep. The next morning, he got up later than usual. He was tired after his restless night. He took his daily national newspaper from the letterbox and went into his kitchen to make some breakfast. He read the newspaper while he ate. For the second time in 2 days, he had a shock. On one of the inside pages, among the ads, there was a photo of a man whose face he immediately recognized. It was the man who had died in the car crash near Thame. Above the photo were the words, "Have you seen this man?" Below it, there was a brief description. Colin Fenton, 35, disappeared on the evening of the 10th of January. If you have any information about him, please phone Julie Fenton on 01522 35912. Had Mark now found the Julie he was looking for? There's certainly a puzzle here, Mark thought. But perhaps I'm beginning to solve it. Chapter 11. The Visit. On the morning that Julie Fenton's ad appeared in the newspapers, she didn't go to her office. She stayed at home, hoping for news. During the morning, 2 people phoned her. They both called to say that they thought they'd seen Colin on the day of his disappearance. They both thought they'd seen him at a service area on the M4 motorway near Swindon. This information didn't help Julie much. She felt no closer to finding Colin. Just before 1 o'clock, the phone rang again. It was a call from a police officer. Colin's car had been found at Heathrow Airport. That afternoon, Julie went to collect the car. A police officer from Heathrow met her and took her to the BMW, which was in one of the long-stay car parks. It was not damaged in any way. "You say you found nothing belonging to my husband inside the car?" Julie asked. "Nothing, madam," the officer replied. Julie opened the driver's door and looked inside. Then she looked inside the boot. "My husband had some luggage with him, a suitcase and a briefcase. Didn't you find those?" "I'm afraid not, madam." "What was he doing here at Heathrow Airport?" "I'm very sorry, madam," the police officer said. "We don't know, but we think that he probably got on a plane. Perhaps he wanted to leave the country. Did your husband have his passport with him?" That evening, Julie looked in the drawer of Colin's bedside table. He usually kept his passport in the drawer. When she didn't find it, she wept tears of anger and grief. She didn't want to believe that Colin had abandoned her. She and Colin had had a difficult marriage. Colin had been irresponsible sometimes, and sometimes he'd been thoughtless. But he wasn't a cruel man. Julie was sitting in the dark, too tired to switch on the light, when the phone rang. She felt for the phone and picked it up. "Julie Fenton?" a man's voice asked. "Yes. My name's Ashwood, Mark Ashwood. I saw your ad in the newspaper. I believe I've got some information about your husband." Julie went cold. "Do you know where he is?" she asked. Mark was not sure how to answer. "No, not exactly, Mrs. Fenton," he said. "I'm sorry, but the news I have isn't good. I'd prefer to meet you and speak to you. Perhaps I could meet you tomorrow." Julie was suspicious. Why did this man want to meet her? What was stopping him giving her the information over the phone? "If you're going to tell me that my husband has left the country, I already know that," she said. "I'm afraid you're wrong about that, Mrs. Fenton," the man said. "But I won't say any more just now. I'd really like to tell you when I meet you. Although the information I have isn't good, I believe it will help you. Can I come and see you tomorrow?" Julie wasn't happy about the man's request, but finally she agreed to meet him. "All right," she said. She gave him her address. "What time can you be here?" "Is 10:30 okay?" the man asked. "Yes, 10:30's fine," Julie said. "I'll see you tomorrow then," the man said. "Goodbye." Julie put the phone down and switched on the light. She realized that she hadn't eaten that evening. She was confused and tired. After some hot tea and a little food, she tried to do some work at the kitchen table, but it was hopeless. Soon she went up to bed. The doorbell rang while Julie was still eating breakfast. She'd slept till 9 o'clock, and she hadn't been downstairs long. "Come into the kitchen," she said to Mark. "Let me give you some coffee. I'm having some myself." Mark followed her into the kitchen. The table was covered in papers where Julie had been working the previous evening. Julie moved the papers and took a mug from the cupboard. Mark saw that there was a pile of unwashed dishes in the sink. Julie poured Mark's coffee and sat down at the table opposite him. "Sorry about the mess," she said. "I woke late." Mark looked at her. Her eyes were tired, her skin was pale. He tried to think of how he should begin his story. "This must be very difficult for you," he said. Julie sipped some coffee and nodded. "You told me to be prepared for bad news," she said. Mark was silent. "I need to know what has happened, Mr. Ashwood." "I'm afraid your husband is dead, Mrs. Fenton," Mark said slowly. He waited for a reaction, but there was none. "It was an accident," Mark went on. "It was quite late in the evening, about 10 o'clock. I was driving behind your husband along a narrow country road. He lost control of his car on some ice, and it crashed into a tree." "But why haven't I been informed?" Julie said. "The police would have told me if my husband had had an accident." "The police believed he was someone else," Mark said. "Someone called John Bentley." Julie laughed nervously. "What are you talking about?" she said. "For some reason, your husband was carrying John Bentley's documents," said Mark. Julie suddenly felt angry. This man seemed crazy. "Where did this accident happen?" she asked. "Not far from Thame, in Oxfordshire," Mark replied. "I'd been to London for the day, and I was driving home to Stratford-upon-Avon." "Let me tell you something, Mr. Ashwood," Julie said. "My husband's BMW was found undamaged in a car park at Heathrow Airport yesterday. And you're telling me that he died in an accident? Please, don't waste my time." "It was a Ford Escort, not a BMW," Mark said. "He must have been driving someone else's car, probably John Bentley's." Julie laughed again. "But why? This is crazy." "Listen, I realize that all this seems strange," Mark said. "That's why I didn't want to speak on the phone. But believe me, what I'm telling you is true." "I think you've made a terrible mistake, Mr. Ashwood," Julie said. "Please don't bother me with any more silly stories. I'm a busy woman." "The man I saw die was your husband," Mark said. "I'm sure of that. He told me your name, Julie. 'Tell Julie I'm sorry,' he said to me." "The man who died must have been this John Bentley," Julie said. "Not my husband." "I thought so too at first," Mark said. "So 2 days ago I went to see John Bentley's wife. But her name wasn't Julie. It was Linda." "And her husband was alive and well, I suppose?" Mark drank some of his coffee. "No," he said quietly. He knew what the woman was going to say next. "Ah, no doubt he died in a car accident," Julie said. She sighed deeply. "I think you'd better go, Mr. Ashwood." Mark stood up. "I know that what I'm saying is a shock for you," he said. "But it's true. I'm sorry if I've made you unhappy. I had to come here and speak to you. Your husband asked me to come. It was his last wish." Suddenly, Julie was crying. "Please, go now," she said. Mark took his business card from his wallet and put it on the table in front of Julie. "I leave you my card," he said. "My phone number's on it. Think about what I've said. Please, call me if you want to talk. I believe I can help." Julie didn't reply. She sat shaking her head, looking down at the floor and crying quietly. Mark left the house sadly. Chapter 12. The Robbery. After Mark Ashwood's unexpected visit to Brentwood, it was clear to the Bentleys that John couldn't stay hidden in the house any longer. Linda found a cheap hotel for him in a suburb which was nearer central London, not far from the River Thames. The hotel was the kind of place where you paid in advance for your room, and nobody asked you any questions. It was an old building, and some of the windows had boards over them. On the ground floor there was a small, ugly bar where people in cheap clothes sat drinking all day. John's room on the first floor was dark and dirty. The glass in the window was cracked. It was late on a Tuesday evening. John Bentley was excited and nervous. He and Linda sat in the cold hotel room, waiting. There was a bottle of whiskey on the table beside the bed. John lifted the bottle to his lips and drank. For a few moments he felt calm. Then the nervous excitement returned. This was the night. After tonight he would be free forever. At 1:15 in the morning, John checked his things. A set of keys, a small torch, a pair of rubber gloves, a roll of adhesive tape, a small wooden box, a car jack, and his gun. He put the keys, the gloves, the torch, the tape, and the gun in his pockets, and he put the jack and the wooden container in his black sports bag. "It's time to go," he told Linda. They got into the van, and Linda drove it towards the centre of London. The city streets were quiet. It took about 20 minutes to reach Sandwell's. The jewellery shop was a 2-storey building. The front of the shop was in a wide, busy shopping street, but there was a back door too. This door was in a quiet road where delivery trucks stopped. In this road, apart from back doors of shops, there were some offices and a bank, but there were no houses. No one went there late at night. Linda drove the van to the back of Sandwell's. She and John checked their watches. It was 1:35. "Come back in exactly half an hour," John said. Then he got out of the van, carrying his sports bag, and he watched as Linda drove slowly away. Standing in the shadow of the shop's back door, John pulled on his rubber gloves. He took the set of keys from his pocket and unlocked the steel shutter that protected the door. Then he lifted the shutter, and he used another key to open the door itself. Now he had 20 seconds to enter the correct code on the keypad of the shop's security system. If he failed, the alarm bells would ring, here and in the nearest police station. John dropped his sports bag inside the door, then he took the torch from his pocket and turned it on. He ran along the corridor which led towards the front of the building. Halfway along the corridor, on the right, was the door to the manager's office, and on the wall outside this was the keypad. By the light from the torch, John quickly keyed in the 6-figure code. Then he ran back along the corridor, pulled down the steel shutter, and locked it from the inside. Next, he closed and locked the door. John stood with his back against the door, breathing hard, his heart beating fast. Now he was safe for a while. He waited for a few moments. Then he picked up his sports bag and walked towards the front of the building again. The corridor led to the shop itself and to the stairs which went up to the workshop on the upper story. But halfway along on the left, opposite Mr. Rose's office door, was the door to the strong room. In here the shop's main stock was kept, as well as some very valuable stones which would be made into special pieces of jewellery in the workshop. Leaving his sports bag in the corridor, John turned to the door of the strong room. It was a heavy steel door with an electronic combination lock. John keyed in the correct code, pushed the door open, and entered the room. There were no windows in the strong room, so it would be safe to switch on the light. But first, John had to do something about the video camera, which was fixed high on the wall above the door. Whenever the light was on inside the strong room, the camera sent pictures to a video recorder in the manager's office. John took off his coat and threw it over the camera so that it covered the lens. Only then did he turn on the light. The strong room was lined with shelves on 3 walls. Against the 4th wall, next to the door, was a steel cabinet with many drawers. Inside these drawers were the precious stones, as well as the most expensive pieces of jewellery that were displayed in the shop during the daytime. On the shelves around the strong room were boxes of good quality but somewhat less expensive pieces. John removed the boxes and carried them to the back door, piling them neatly, one on top of another. Then he returned to the strong room. In a corner, he found a large, empty box. He put it on a table next to the steel cabinet. Then he removed the top 2 drawers, the drawers containing precious stones, from the cabinet and carefully placed them inside the empty box. He added the trays of extremely valuable rings, necklaces, and brooches from the lower drawers. When the box was full, he took the roll of adhesive tape from his pocket, sealed the box, and pulled it to the back door. Finally, he turned off the strong room light, pulled his coat down from the camera, and went out into the corridor, closing the door behind him. He reset the lock, and he took the wooden box from his bag. He opened it, and took out a piece of plastic explosive, which he pressed onto the strong room lock, together with a detonator. He used the tape to keep the detonator and its timer in place. Next, John picked up his sports bag, removed the car jack, put the wooden box back in the bag, and went into the front of the shop. He held his torch in his mouth and opened 2 glass display cabinets with his keys. The cabinets contained some good pieces of jewellery, and he threw the contents into his bag. Finally, he relocked the cabinets and used the car jack to smash the glass. Then he took the sports bag to the back door and put it on the pile of boxes. He checked his watch. It was 5 minutes to 2. There was no time to lose. He had another 10 minutes before Linda returned with the van. John ran up the stairs to the workshop, holding the car jack in his hand. There was a skylight in the roof, which was locked from the inside, and below the skylight was a grill of metal bars. John stood on a chair. He took his car jack and pushed it between the 2 central bars of the grill. He turned the jack's long handle quickly, forcing the bars apart. Soon the gap between them was wide enough for a man to climb through. He removed the jack and used it to smash the skylight's glass and lock. He opened the skylight. John hurried downstairs to the strong room door, still carrying the jack. He checked his watch. It was 2:05. Linda should arrive at any moment. He set the timer of the detonator and ran along the corridor. He leant against a wall and waited, breathing hard, wiping the sweat from his face with the back of his hand. After a minute, he heard a small explosion. He ran back to the strong room door. The lock had been destroyed. At that moment, he heard a van stop outside the back door of the shop. He unlocked and opened the door, then he unlocked and lifted the shutter. Linda had parked the van just outside, and had opened its back doors. John and Linda worked quickly, lifting the boxes from the corridor and sliding them into the back of the van. When they loaded the boxes, John threw in his jack and his sports bag. He closed the doors. Then he rushed back inside to the keypad and reset the alarm code while Linda started the van. Immediately, the alarm started ringing. The noise was terrible, and it seemed to fill the empty street. John ran back outside, closed and locked the back door of the shop, pulled down the shutter, and locked that. Then he jumped into the van, slamming the passenger's door behind him. Linda drove away down the street at high speed, the tires screaming as she turned the corner. But after a few minutes, she slowed down. Soon she was driving carefully towards the cheap hotel by the river. John got out of the van at the hotel, and Linda drove on till she came to the Red Lion. Frankie Simpson was waiting for her at the pub. It was 2:50 in the morning, and there was nobody in the street. Frankie helped Linda to get the jewellery into the building. Then the 2 of them began to check the items of jewellery against the list that Linda had already given Frankie. It was a long job, and it took them nearly 2 hours. Linda kept some of the jewellery. A few pieces she wanted to wear herself. The others she would sell later, when she and John had escaped to Spain. While Linda had a drink, Frankie Simpson began separating and repacking the jewellery, ready for his men to deliver to other fences in London, Birmingham and Manchester. 2 days, Frankie said. You'll have your money in 2 days. OK. Right, said Linda. I'll meet you here on Friday evening. Come at around 5 o'clock, Frankie said. I'll be here, said Linda. When Linda finally got home, it was almost 6 o'clock. She went to bed for a while, but at 7:30 she was up again. She had to go to work. Linda arrived at Sandwell's at 10 to 9, as she did every Monday to Friday. 2 police cars were parked nearby. Linda walked into the shop, trying to look surprised. The other staff members were already there. They were standing together, talking. Uniformed police officers were examining the broken display cabinets. Mr. Rose was talking to a police inspector who was wearing a raincoat. Linda walked over to her colleagues. "What's happened here?" she said, looking around the shop. "And when did it happen?" "We think some thieves got in through the skylight in the middle of the night," one of them replied. "They smashed the glass and the lock, and they forced open the bars of the grille." "Are there any clues that will help the police to identify the thieves?" Linda asked quietly. "A well-organised gang, that's what the police think," the colleague replied. "There must have been several thieves, and they must have worked fast. They broke in at 2:05, that's when the alarm bells started ringing, and they'd gone when the police arrived at 2:15. The manager finished speaking to the police inspector. He came over to Linda and her colleagues. "The police have asked us not to touch anything here until they have checked for fingerprints," Mr. Rose said, "and they will talk to each of you to see if you know anything that might help them. Perhaps someone will make coffee for us all. I'll be in my office." One of the policemen came to talk to Linda. He asked if she had any ideas about who the thieves were, and he asked where she had been the previous evening. But Mr. Rose had told the police officers that Linda's husband had recently died, and the man questioned her very gently. When she said that she had been alone at home the previous night, the officer thanked her politely and went on to talk to someone else. Linda made lots of coffee. She gave some to her colleagues and to the police officers. Then she took a cup to the manager's office. Mr. Rose was talking on the phone to the shop's insurance company. Linda put the coffee on his desk. She was about to leave the room when the manager finished his phone call. "Linda, there's no need for you to stay here," he said. "The shop will be closed for a few days, I expect. Since you're leaving at the end of the week anyway, you might as well finish work now. I expect you have a lot to do before you move to Scotland." "That's very good of you, Mr. Rose," Linda said. "I am very busy. There's a lot of packing and cleaning to do at the house." "Are you going back to Glasgow immediately?" "Yes," Linda replied. "I've been lonely in London since John's death. I need to move away. The sooner the better." "Do you need any help?" the manager asked. "I could send one of the others to help you if you want." "No, I can manage," Linda said. "But thanks anyway." "We'll miss you," Mr. Rose said. "We'll miss both of you. John was a good man and a hard worker." Linda looked down for a moment. "Yes," she said. A few minutes later, Linda left Sandwell's for the last time. She walked through the shop, stepping over pieces of broken glass, and out into the street. Chapter 13. The Truth. On the Thursday evening, despite being tired after a long day's work, Julie Fenton decided to do some housework. She began by picking up the newspapers and magazines which lay all over the house. Then she started to clean her bedroom. Unwashed clothes lay in a big pile on a chair. She washed them and dried them. Then she folded them and put them back on the chair, ready to iron. In one of the drawers in the bedroom, Julie kept her personal documents, bank statements, receipts, her passport, etc. She wanted to check a couple of the bank statements. She pulled open the drawer, and she took out the documents to start sorting them. It was then that she saw something that gave her a bad shock. Under the pile of documents was Colin's passport. And if Colin's passport was in the drawer, then he couldn't have left the country. He couldn't have left the country without the passport, so he hadn't abandoned her. He must have had an accident. Perhaps he was lying ill or unconscious somewhere. Julie sat down on the bed. Then she remembered what Mark Ashwood had told her. On the day of Colin's disappearance, Mark had been driving north near Thame, when he had seen a fatal accident. That was at about 10:30 p.m. Other people said they'd seen Colin at a service area on the M4 earlier the same evening. What if Colin had been involved with this John Bentley, the man that Mark Ashwood had talked about? Julie realized she needed to speak to Mark Ashwood again. She hurried downstairs, hoping that she hadn't thrown away Mark's business card. After a minute, she found it in the kitchen, among some letters that were lying on top of the fridge. She picked up the phone and called Mark's number immediately. "This is Julie Fenton," she said when Mark answered. "I'm glad you phoned," Mark said. "I need to talk to you," said Julie. "I've thought about what you said. You could be right. Perhaps the man you saw die was my husband. I need to find out as much as possible about that man's death." "Perhaps it's better if we meet," Mark said. "Can you come to Stratford tomorrow?" "Yes," Julie said. "I'm busy in the morning, but I can be with you by 2:30, if that's okay." "That's fine," Mark replied. "The address is on my card." The following morning, Julie got up very early. She did about 5 hours' work before driving to Stratford-upon-Avon. It was a clear, cold, sunny day. The journey took about 2 hours. Mark made some coffee. Then he and Julie sat in his living room, drinking from small china cups. Mark described the accident once more. "Why do you think Colin had Bentley's documents? And why was he driving Bentley's car?" she asked when Mark had finished speaking. "I wish I knew," Mark replied. "I went to see Bentley's wife. Of course, I expected her to be called Julie. I felt foolish when I found out that her name was Linda. But that wasn't the only surprising thing. There was a man in the house. I only saw him for a moment, but he looked exactly like your husband." "What are you saying?" Julie exclaimed. "Well, obviously it wasn't Colin," Mark said. "Then who was it?" "It could have been John Bentley," Mark said. "I'm sure that he and your husband had exchanged identities on that day in January. I don't know why, but they were able to do it because they were doubles. They looked just like each other." There was a silence. Julie looked thoughtful. Then she said quietly, "There must have been a funeral." "Yes, I suppose you're right. It won't be hard to find out if there was a funeral for someone called John Bentley in the Brentwood area in the weeks after the accident." Julie thought that there was something deeply wrong about all this. Colin had died, but there was no official record of his death. Someone else, some strange woman, had taken Colin from her, had given him a new name, and had had him buried or cremated. "This is horrible, Mark," she said. "I'm sorry," Mark said. "I really am sorry." "I won't rest until I've given Colin back his own name," Julie said. "Will you help me?" Mark looked at the sad woman who was sitting next to him. "Yes, I'll help you," he said. "Let's go for a walk. It's a sunny day. We can talk some more and decide what to do next." The small town of Stratford was peaceful that afternoon. They walked along the banks of the River Avon. A woman and 2 children were throwing pieces of bread to the swans and ducks on the river. Julie and Mark sat on a bench looking at the river. There were huge willow trees on the far bank. In a few weeks' time, there would be new green leaves on them. There would be new life everywhere. "It's time for me to start a new life too, Mark," Julie said, looking at the trees. "But first I have to go and see this woman, this Linda Bentley. She's the only person who can give me the answers that I need before I can start my new life." "I'll come with you," Mark said. "I can take you to where she lives." "All right," Julie said. "But can we go now?" Mark looked at his watch. It was 4:45. If they left immediately, they could be in London by 6 or 6:30. "Come on, then," he said. "We'll take my car." Chapter 14. The Chase. While Mark and Julie were driving towards London, Linda Bentley was making preparations to leave her house. A large suitcase lay open in her bedroom. Linda was filling it with some clothes and some other personal belongings. All her other clothes and everything else that she did not want to take with her were in plastic bags outside the front door. In her shoulder bag, she put her own passport and her husband's too. The fact that John was officially dead wouldn't stop him travelling. Linda hadn't told the British Passport Authority that he was dead, so he could still use his passport, and the border officials in France and Spain wouldn't know that he was officially dead, of course. Once they were in Spain, they could get themselves new identities and new documents. By around 3:30, Linda was ready to leave, but there was something she had to do first. She had to get her money from Frankie Simpson. She closed the suitcase and carried it downstairs to the hall. She drove the van to the Red Lion. Frankie was waiting for her in an upstairs room. Linda sat down opposite him. Frankie pointed to a holdall by her chair. Linda opened it. It was full of banknotes. "I've counted the money," Frankie said. "It's all in £50 notes. They're in bundles of £5,000. Linda quickly counted the bundles. "Thanks, Frankie," she said. "If you ever need my help again," Frankie went on, "you know where to find me, Linda." Linda stood up. "Yes, thanks, Frankie," she said. "But this won't happen again, and you won't be seeing me any more." It was just before 6 o'clock when Linda arrived back at her house. A few minutes later, the owner of the house arrived to collect the keys. Linda brought her suitcase from the hall and put it in the van next to the holdall. Then she closed the door of the house and put the keys into the owner's hand. "Goodbye," she said, "and thank you." She took one last look at the house, then she got in the van and started the engine. She didn't notice the blue car that had parked on the other side of the street a few seconds earlier. Mark and Julie had arrived outside the Bentley's house just in time to see Linda put a suitcase into her van and give her house keys to a tall, thin man with a moustache. "We're too late," Mark said. "She's leaving." "We must follow her, Mark," Julie said. "I must know where she's going. If we don't follow her now, I may never find her again." Mark turned his car round and drove after Linda's van. The streets were full of traffic and nobody was going very fast. Mark made sure he always kept the van in sight, and at first Linda didn't notice that she was being followed. But half an hour later, when she arrived at the cheap hotel near the river, she was beginning to worry about the blue Volvo that was always behind her. Mark drove past the hotel and parked a little farther along the street. Linda had got out of her van and she looked at Mark's car as she entered the hotel. She thought she recognized the driver. There was no one at the hotel reception desk. Linda walked up the dirty wooden stairs to room number 10, where John was waiting for her. She knocked on the door of the room. "It's me, Linda," she called. "Get your things. It's time to go." John opened the door. His suitcase was already packed. "Okay," his wife said. "Come on, let's get moving." Downstairs, the reception desk was still empty. John put his room key on the desk, and they left the hotel. It was completely dark outside now. As they drove away, Linda noticed that the blue Volvo was still behind them. They crossed to the south side of the River Thames and drove on towards the port of Dover. In Dover they would get on a ferry to France. Soon they would be safe. But whenever Linda looked in her driving mirror, the blue car was always behind them. Mark didn't care whether Linda noticed that she was being followed. He needed to keep the van in sight. But after half an hour, he saw that the van was turning off the main road. He turned off too, and soon he was following the white van along a narrow country lane. Suddenly, the lane became even narrower, and it curved sharply. On the bend, Linda stopped the van, completely blocking the way. Mark stopped a few meters behind it. Then there was a flash in the darkness, as someone fired a gun. The windscreen of Mark's car shattered, and Julie screamed, falling to one side. There was blood on her coat. In the bright beam of the Volvo's headlights, Mark saw a man running towards him, a gun in his hand. Mark put the car into reverse and tried to turn round. But John Bentley was getting closer, holding the gun with both hands now and taking aim. Bentley ran towards the driver's door of the car. As soon as he was close enough, Mark threw the door open, smashing it against Bentley's chest. He heard the sound of gunfire again, but he did not know where the bullet went. Mark jumped out of the car and threw himself at Bentley. The two men fell heavily to the ground. Mark struggled to hold Bentley's arm so that he couldn't fire his gun again. Then he felt a sharp pain in his side. Linda had come from the van and she was kicking him. A moment later she grabbed the gun from her husband's hand and hit Mark on the back of the head with it. As he became unconscious, he heard the woman say, "Get into the van quickly, John. Let's get away from here." The Bentleys drove on to Dover, arriving there about an hour later. They left their van in a car park and got onto the 11 o'clock ferry for Calais as foot passengers. John was carrying 2 large suitcases. Linda had a hold-all. Nobody stopped them at customs or passport control in Calais. A few hours later, they were racing across the French countryside on a train going south, towards Spain and freedom. Mark woke several hours later in a hospital bed. At first he didn't know where he was. There was a bandage round his aching head, and he felt terribly tired. But after a few minutes, he remembered that Julie had been shot. He called for a nurse. When the nurse came into his room, the first thing he said was, "Where's Julie? Is she all right?" "Don't worry, Mr. Ashwood," the nurse said. "She'll be fine. But she's lost a lot of blood. The bullet went through her shoulder, close to her neck." "What happened? I can't remember anything." "Don't try. Sleep now," the nurse said. "You're both going to be all right." Some days later, Mark learnt that a motorcyclist had found him lying unconscious by his car, with Julie lying unconscious inside it. He had phoned for an ambulance and the police. When Mark and Julie were feeling better, a police officer visited them, and they both gave him statements about the attack. Mark explained the whole story about Colin Fenton and John and Linda Bentley. With this information, the police were able to connect Bentley with the robbery at Sandwell's. At first, Mark was surprised that they believed his strange story, but a policeman told him that detectives had discovered that the lock on the skylight in the roof had been broken from the inside, not from the outside. Also, There were no footprints on the roof, and in the shop there was a further clue. The way that the broken glass was lying in the display cabinets showed that the jewellery had been removed before the glass had been smashed. These clues made the police believe that it was an inside job, that someone who had keys and knew the alarm code had done the robbery. The robber had reset the alarm on his way out to confuse the police. But now, after hearing Mark's story, the police understood what had happened. The London police reported the crime to Interpol, the international police organisation. But it was too late to catch the Bentleys. By now, the police thought, they had reached the safety of Spain. They'd probably changed their names and changed the way they looked. It would take a great deal of luck to find them. Chapter 15. Officially Dead. Julie Fenton spent 10 days in hospital before she was allowed to go home. When she was back at work, Mark Ashwood visited her often. Soon he'd become her close friend. That spring, Julie stopped using Mr. Booker as her accountant, and she asked Mark to look after her company's financial records instead. One sunny evening in late May, Julie and Mark drove to a restaurant in one of the villages outside Bath. Mark had said that he wanted to take Julie to dinner and talk to her about the future of CJF Software Solutions. "I've been thinking about your problem with Jackman's," Mark said. "Tell me where we went wrong," Julie said, sipping a glass of cold white wine. "I think that instead of trying to sell your software to Jackman's and other companies like them, you should sell them licenses to use it," Mark said. "You could sell licenses to use the software for a period of time, perhaps a year." "Go on," Julie said. "Well, first, it's cheaper for the client," Mark continued. "They get the full use of the product for a year for much less than the cost of buying it. Second, if you update the product, if you make improvements to it, the license will allow the client to have the new version free. They'll always have the latest software." "That's great for the client, but what about my company?" Julie asked. "The advantage for you is client loyalty," Mark replied. "When a client's license period ends, they won't have to buy new software, they'll just have to buy a new license. That will be much cheaper, so the client will want to go on using your product rather than buying another company's software. So the client gets regular updates, and you get loyalty. And when you do produce a completely new product, you can sell it to your existing clients at a discount. It's good for both of you." Julie looked thoughtful. She sipped her wine again. "I think it's a great idea," she said at last. "Mark, you're a genius." "There's another thing," Mark went on. "I think that all of your company's work could be done without an office. Offices are expensive. All you need is the equipment and the staff. Your staff could work at home. You'd obviously need to have regular meetings, but you could organize the work so that your staff can work independently. Your own house could be the company's official address. Your secretary would be in constant touch with you by phone. You'll save a lot of money if you don't rent an office. Your company will soon be earning well again." "Mark, you're wonderful," she said. And she kissed him. Later in the year, Mark sold his house in Stratford, and he moved to Bath. He became the financial director to CJF Software Solutions. By the end of the year, Julie and Mark knew that they were in love. Julie sold her house, and she went to live with Mark. Mark tried to get Julie interested in rock climbing. At first, she didn't think she was going to like the sport, but one day, a few years after their first meeting, she was holding on to a steep rock face with the sea far below her. Above her head, Mark was standing on a ledge, holding her rope. "Come on up," he shouted. "You're doing wonderfully." Julie looked down at the sea and quickly closed her eyes, but she knew that the rope was keeping her safe. As she moved slowly onwards up the rock face, she thought, "What am I doing here? How my life has changed! But I'm happier than I've been for years." One Sunday morning, 7 years after Colin Fenton's disappearance, Mark and Julie were sitting in their garden, relaxing. Mark was looking at a book about gardening and thinking about some new plants he wanted to grow. Julie was sitting next to him, reading a newspaper. Everything was very quiet. Suddenly, tears came into Julie's eyes. A moment later they were running down her cheeks. She got up quickly, leaving the paper on her chair, and walked away across the grass to the end of the garden. Mark looked up at Julie. He saw her drying her eyes with a handkerchief. He wondered what had made her sad. Then he noticed a photograph in the newspaper on her chair, and he knew the answer. The photo showed two people, John and Linda Bentley. Then Mark saw the headline above it, "British couple arrested for jewellery robbery after 7 years." Under the photograph, Mark read the story. A British couple were arrested in Spain last week in connection with crimes that took place 7 years ago. They are accused of robbery and attempted murder. John and Linda Bentley will fly back to Britain tomorrow to be charged. "We received information from Interpol about these two people," said Detective Inspector Williams of the London Police, who was in charge of the case. "The Bentleys had been living in the south of Spain, using false names. They were only discovered when the woman made a claim to a Spanish court. Her aunt, who also lived in Spain, had died, leaving her property to Mrs. Bentley. To claim the property, Linda Bentley had to use her real name. That was when Interpol found out about the couple. Mrs. Bentley said that she was innocent of the charges, but she did agree that the man she lived with was her husband, John Bentley, who was thought to have died 7 years ago. She said that the man whose body was cremated as her husband's was their friend, Mr. Colin Fenton." Mark put the paper down. Julie walked towards him and sat down at his side. She had stopped crying now. "7 years is a long time," she said. "A lot has happened to me, to us. What happened 7 years ago broke my life into pieces. You helped me put the pieces together again. Colin's death was an accident. It was nobody's fault. But when he was cremated as John Bentley, his name was taken away from him." She pointed to the photograph of the Bentleys. "It's always worried me that I didn't know how he got involved with those people. Perhaps now I'll learn the truth. Colin will have his own name again. At last, he'll be officially dead."